I've always been the type who enjoys solitude more than most people, not in a lonely way. I just liked my own company. I didn't travel much during college, so when I landed a remote job earlier last year, I decided to reward myself. I planned a solo trip, no itinerary, just me, my camera, and my car. The freedom was addicting. I picked a route that led through Colorado into Utah, eventually snaking through parts of Nevada. One of my goals was to photograph remote ghost towns and abandoned mining camps. I'd always been fascinated by places that time forgot. My third night on the road was when everything shifted. I had passed through a small Colorado town called Marble earlier that day, and someone in a diner recommended I check out an old silver mining camp about 30 miles away. It wasn't on any of the travel blogs or abandoned places websites I frequented, which immediately intrigued me. The woman told me the trail could be rough, but it was still drivable with my 4Runner. I followed her scribbled directions through a winding dirt road flanked by thick pine trees, the sun just beginning to slip behind the mountains. I wasn't worried. I had a rooftop tent, enough supplies for 2 weeks, and a decent flashlight. Cell reception dropped off halfway through the drive, but I'd expected that. I reached the clearing around 7:30 p.m. There were remnants of a small mining settlement. A few cabins, all in disrepair, one leaning heavily to its side as if it were whispering secrets to the earth. The mine entrance itself was boarded shut, though time had warped the wood enough that someone determined could probably tear through it. I didn't try. Instead, I walked around with my camera, snapping pictures. The forest around the clearing was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling, just stillness. I remember thinking that silence shouldn't feel this heavy. I set up camp near the largest cabin and cooked a quick meal. The stars came out in full force, dazzling and clear. I crawled into the rooftop tent around 10, pulled my sleeping bag around me, and let the mountain air lull me into sleep. What woke me was not a sound. It was the lack of one. Around 2 a.m., I opened my eyes to a thick silence that seemed unnatural, like the air itself was holding its breath. I hadn't heard anything specific, no footsteps, no knocking, but something felt wrong. I listened, held my breath. Then it came, a soft creaking like old wood bending under weight. It came from the ground below. I stayed still, hoping it was just the wind catching the ruins of the cabin. Another creak. Then a low, dragging sound. It sounded like someone or something was slowly pulling itself across the gravel near my vehicle. I could feel the sound rather than hear it, like it was vibrating the cold into my bones. I sat up as quietly as I could and peered through the mesh of the tent window. The moon was bright enough to cast shadows, and I scanned the area around the clearing. I didn't see anything. No movement. Just the leaning cabin, the collapsed mine shaft, and trees that seemed to press in closer than before. Then I saw it. A figure stood just at the edge of the clearing, near the tree line. It was facing me. It was completely still, but its posture was wrong, slightly bent, like its spine couldn't decide which direction to grow. The arms hung too long, nearly touching the knees. Even though it stood over 40 feet away, I felt certain it knew I was watching it. I blinked, and it was gone. No sound. No rustling leaves, just gone. I stayed up until sunrise, every few minutes scanning the woods. Nothing returned. As soon as it was light, I packed up. I didn't eat, didn't take any more photos. I just drove. Back in cell range around noon, I debated with myself whether I'd imagined it. Sleep deprivation, maybe? But no, I'd felt its presence too strongly for it to be a dream. I promised myself no more sleeping near ruins. 2 days later, in Utah, I broke that promise. I was several miles into a trail that cut through canyonlands. There were cave dwellings carved into the cliff walls, likely used by indigenous peoples hundreds of years ago. I didn't go into any out of respect, but I set up camp within sight of them, just off the trail. The sun was brutal during the day, but nights dropped cold and quick. That evening, I reviewed my photos under the fading light. I paused on one taken back in Colorado, the one with the leaning cabin. In the window, there was something. I zoomed in. My stomach flipped. In the glass, just visible in the reflection, was that same crooked figure, watching from behind me. I threw the phone down and sat very still. A noise started from behind me. Soft footfalls over dirt and rock. Slow, deliberate. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After a minute, they stopped. I turned my head slightly to the side, pretending to stretch. From the corner of my eye, I could see something standing in the shadow of one of the cave openings. Not entering, just hovering. I packed up right then, in the dark, fumbling with my gear. I didn't care if I left anything behind. I hiked the 2 miles back to my car using just my headlamp and shaky adrenaline. The whole time I heard footsteps pacing me, never running, never chasing, just following. I drove until sunrise and found a cheap motel near Moab. I stayed inside for 3 straight days. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe I'd spooked myself with that photo. I deleted it just in case. I didn't want to see that window again. But things didn't stop. Back at the motel, strange things started happening. It began small. Lights flickering, my phone glitching, the room heater turning on despite the summer heat. Then, one night around 3 a.m., the fire alarm went off. I rushed outside with a few others from neighboring rooms. The manager came out groggily, apologizing, saying there was no fire, just a faulty sensor. But when I returned to my room, the mirror was fogged, as if someone had taken a hot shower. I hadn't used it that night. In the fog, traced with a finger, were 2 words: "Found you." I left the motel before dawn and started driving east. I didn't stop until I hit Denver. Even back home, I wasn't free. My dreams changed. I'd wake up soaked in sweat, remembering long tunnels, tight spaces, and something brushing against my ankles in the dark. I started hearing knocks in the middle of the night, 3 soft taps, always from a different wall. I brought in an electrician, thinking it was some weird wiring issue. He found nothing wrong. My neighbor said she sometimes saw someone standing in my upstairs window when I was at work. I lived alone. I reached out to a local historian about that mining camp near Marble. She emailed me back a few days later, saying she couldn't find any record of a silver mine in that area, not official at least. But she mentioned that in the late 1800s, a group of prospectors had gone missing in those woods. Some said they'd unearthed something they shouldn't have. When locals went looking, they found the cabins abandoned and strange symbols carved into the trees nearby. Eventually, the area was declared cursed and left off maps to discourage visitors. She ended the email with a sentence I can't forget. Not forget. Some places don't want to be found, but once they are, they tend to follow. I moved apartments. I got a roommate. I even adopted a dog. Things have gotten quieter, but once in a while, usually on cold, windless nights, I hear those dragging footsteps again, just beyond the walls. I never look out the window when I hear them. Not anymore. I'm afraid one day it'll be standing at the foot of my bed, just watching, waiting. Story. The end. I remember the trip clearly, though I wish I could forget it. It started as an innocent adventure, a chance to escape the chaos of daily life and spend some time alone in nature. I'd always loved hiking and exploring, so when I found out about a small trail deep in the Appalachian Mountains, far off the beaten path, I thought it would be perfect. No cell service, no people, just me, the woods, and the silence. I was looking forward to some peace, some quiet, and maybe a little solitude to reflect. I packed my gear carefully the night before. A tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a map, compass, flashlight, and a journal. I didn't tell many people where I was going. I liked the idea of disappearing for a bit, of being completely alone. The drive to the trailhead was long but beautiful, the mountains looming on the horizon like ancient guardians. The air was crisp and smelled like pine and earth. I felt alive. The hike in was tougher than I expected. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places, and slick with mud from recent rain. After several hours, I finally reached a clearing where I planned to camp near a small creek. It was secluded and serene, the perfect spot. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and sat back, listening to the sounds of the forest settling into night. The first evening was peaceful. The fire crackled and the sky was clear, full of stars. I wrote a bit in my journal, noting the beauty around me and how good it felt to be disconnected from the world. But as darkness deepened, something subtle shifted. It began with the silence becoming too heavy, as if the forest was holding its breath. I noticed how the usual sounds of nighttime animals, frogs, crickets, owls, had stopped. It was unnervingly quiet. Later, as I lay in my tent trying to sleep, I thought I heard a faint tapping, like someone gently knocking on wood. I unzipped the tent flap cautiously and looked around. Nothing. Just the shadows of trees dancing in the firelight. I told myself it was probably a branch hitting the side of the tent in the wind and went back to bed, though sleep didn't come easy. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a sudden chill. The tent was cold despite the fire I'd kept burning earlier. Outside, I could hear something moving, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the campsite. My heart pounded. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by a whisper so faint I barely caught it. It sounded like a woman's voice, soft and sorrowful, repeating a single name over and over. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The beam swept over the clearing, but caught nothing but shadows. I called out softly, asking if anyone was there. No response. The whispering stopped as if it knew I was awake. I shut the tent quickly and tried to calm myself, though my hands shook. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Stress, isolation, maybe a dream. I packed up my campsite and decided to hike further along the trail, hoping the change of scenery would help. As I walked, the forest thickened and the path grew steeper. I felt watched, like unseen eyes tracked me from the shadows. When I looked behind, I saw nothing but trees. About 2 miles in, I stumbled upon an old cabin, mostly collapsed and overrun by vines. Curious, I approached carefully. The door hung open, creaking in the breeze. Inside, the air was musty and cold. Old furniture lay broken and rotting, and the floor was covered in leaves and dirt. On the walls, scratched into the wood, were words, "Leave before the night." A shiver ran down my spine. I stepped back and noticed a small stone marker near the cabin, partially buried. It looked like a grave marker, just a simple stone with faded writing. I couldn't make out the full name, only the word Maggie and the date 1896. I took a photo, feeling a strange heaviness settle in my chest. As I turned to leave, a sudden gust slammed the cabin door shut behind me. The sound echoed sharply through the forest. I hurried back to the trail, glancing over my shoulder as the shadows seemed to deepen. That evening, back at my campsite, I tried to keep the fire blazing. The night fell quickly, darker than before. I heard the tapping again, louder this time. I shone my flashlight toward the edge of the clearing where the trees met the darkness. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure, a woman in a long dress, standing motionless just beyond the firelight. When I blinked, she was gone. Then the whispering returned, louder and clearer. "Maggie!" It circled the camp, soft but insistent. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, trying not to panic. The footsteps came again, slow and measured, pacing around my tent. I lay still, too frightened to move or speak. Hours passed like that. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped my tent and ran, packing up my things as fast as I could. On the way back down the trail, I kept thinking about the cabin and the grave. Who was Maggie? Why was her spirit still here, lingering in the woods? Back in town, I visited the local library and asked about the cabin and the graveyard. An old librarian told me a story about a young woman named Maggie who had lived in the area over a century ago. She died tragically in a fire that consumed the cabin during a stormy night. The townsfolk said her spirit was never at rest, still searching for peace or warning travelers to stay away. I left with a heavy heart. I don't know if I believe in ghosts now, but I know what I felt. That cold presence, the whispers, the tapping. I still have the photo of the grave marker. Sometimes when I look at it, I swear I can see a faint figure behind it, watching. I haven't returned to those mountains, and I don't plan to. Some places carry memories too painful to ignore, and some spirits never find the rest they seek. Story the end. I was always drawn to solo trips, something about packing light, hitting the road with nothing but a backpack and my own company. It was the perfect way to escape the noise of everyday life and clear my head. I've done plenty of solo hikes and camping trips before, but this one was supposed to be different, a real test of my limits. I chose a remote area in the Appalachian Mountains, a place called Devil's Knob, known for its dense forests, steep ridges, and legends that locals whispered about, but rarely discussed openly. The plan was simple. Hike in, set up camp near a clearing I found on a topo map, spend a couple of nights alone, then hike back out. I didn't tell many people where I was going. The area had no cell signal, so it was just me and the wilderness. The solitude was part of the appeal. I wanted to disconnect completely. The first day went smoothly. The weather was cool and crisp, perfect for hiking. The forest was thick with towering oaks and pines, their leaves whispering in the gentle breeze. As I made my way deeper into the woods, I noticed the usual signs of wildlife: deer tracks, bird calls, the rustle of small animals, but nothing alarming. The trail was faint, almost overgrown, but manageable. By late afternoon, I reached the clearing marked on my map, a small patch of flat land surrounded by dense trees and bushes. It was ideal for camping. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small campfire. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. I cooked some dehydrated food, drank water from my filter, and settled in for the night. The forest grew dark, the temperature dropping sharply. I kept the fire going, the crackling flames offering a comforting presence. As I sat there staring into the fire, I heard a faint sound, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. I paused, listening carefully. It wasn't the usual forest sounds. The whispering seemed to be coming from just beyond the edge of the clearing, where the trees grew thickest. I told myself it was just the wind through the leaves, or maybe an animal rustling about. Still, it felt off, uneasy. Night deepened. I zipped up my tent and tried to sleep, but the whispers returned, faint and irregular. Sometimes they sounded like low voices, unintelligible but persistent. My flashlight was by my side, and I kept my phone close, even though I knew there was no signal. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into restless sleep. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night, heart pounding. There was a shadow moving just outside my tent. I froze, straining to see through the thin fabric. The fire had died down to glowing embers. The shadow flickered again, moving slowly around the perimeter of the clearing. I whispered to myself to stay calm and not make noise. The shadow seemed humanoid, but indistinct, like a dark blur. My first instinct was to think it was another camper or a hiker, but who else would be out here this late? I fumbled for my flashlight, clicking it on and swinging the beam toward the shadow, but it was gone. No sound, no movement, just the stillness of the night. The rest of the night was fitful. Every time I closed my eyes, the whispering voices returned, growing louder and more urgent. I thought I heard my name, barely audible but unmistakable. I told myself it was just the wind messing with my mind. By dawn, I was too shaken to stay. I packed up quickly and started hiking back the way I came, my pace brisk and eyes constantly scanning the forest. The daylight didn't chase away the unease that had settled deep inside me. As I moved, I found more signs that something was wrong. The trail I had carefully marked on my GPS started to glitch. Points disappeared, and the device froze repeatedly. That had never happened before on any other trip. Then I saw a figure in the distance, standing still among the trees. I called out, but got no response. When I got closer, the figure was gone. My mind was racing. Was I hallucinating? Sleep deprived? The woods were playing tricks on me? I kept hiking, trying to reach the road where I could get cell service and call for help if needed. The forest grew darker, the trees seeming to close in. I heard footsteps behind me, but every time I stopped and turned, no one was there. The whispering voices had returned, louder now, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was desperate, almost angry. After hours of walking, I reached a small abandoned cabin. It looked dilapidated, with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. Despite its appearance, I decided to take shelter there for a while. I stepped inside cautiously. The air was stale and cold. The floorboards creaked under my boots. There was old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. Suddenly, I felt a chill brush past me, like a cold breath on my neck. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, but saw nothing. Then I noticed something carved into the wooden wall. Strange symbols and words in an old script. My heart hammered as I tried to decipher them. One word was clear: leave. I was about to leave the cabin when a soft sobbing echoed through the room. I froze. It sounded like a woman crying, sorrowful and real. The noise grew louder, surrounding me, pressing against my chest. I wanted to scream, but couldn't move. The sobbing was suddenly replaced by a low growl, a guttural sound that filled the cabin with menace. I bolted out of the cabin and ran without looking back, stumbling through the underbrush until I was out of breath. I had no idea where I was exactly, but I just kept moving, desperate to escape whatever was in those woods. As night fell again, I found myself back at the clearing. My tent was torn apart, the fire pit cold and scattered. I realized I hadn't left it like that. Panic surged through me. I wanted to scream into the dark forest, but I was utterly alone. I spent the second night trying to stay awake. holding a large stick as a makeshift weapon. The whispers returned, now clearer. Urgent warnings, fragmented sentences about a curse and restless spirits. I realized the locals' legends were true. This was a place haunted by those who had died tragically in the mountains, unable to move on. Morning finally came. Exhausted and terrified, I packed what was left of my gear and started walking toward the nearest ranger station I had marked on my GPS, praying for rescue. The journey was grueling. The forest seemed to resist me, trails disappearing and looping back. Shadows flickered at the edge of my vision. I heard voices calling my name, weeping and pleading. When I finally reached the ranger station, I was a wreck, dirty, scratched, and almost delirious. The ranger was surprised to see me, especially since the area had been closed off recently after several people went missing. I told him everything: the whispers, the shadow, the cabin, the symbols. He listened carefully, then shared what little he knew. Devil's Knob was known as cursed ground, with many stories of hikers who vanished or returned changed, haunted by things no one else could see. I never went back after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that something followed me out of those woods, something that wasn't entirely done with me. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint whispering on the wind, calling me back to the forest, to that place where the dead wait. Story the end. The idea had come to me on a whim, something I never expected to actually go through with. I've always enjoyed solo trips. There's a certain peace in wandering alone, the kind that forces you to confront yourself without distractions. This time, I wanted something different, something remote, something that felt untouched. I found an old cabin nestled deep in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, miles away from the nearest town. It wasn't advertised much, just a simple rental off the grid with only basic amenities. The description promised silence, nature, and isolation. Perfect. I packed up my gear the night before: a small backpack, a tent just in case, some canned food, water, a flashlight, my phone with no reception, and a worn-out paperback to keep me company. I told a couple of friends where I was going, just so someone had a rough idea, then set off early morning, driving past winding roads flanked by towering trees shrouded in mist. The air was thick and damp. The GPS lost signal miles before the cabin, so I relied on the printed directions and a rough map the owner emailed me. When I finally pulled up to the gravel driveway, I was greeted by the sight of the old cabin. Weathered wood, a stone chimney with faint traces of smoke, a rusted porch swing barely hanging on its chains, it felt untouched, almost frozen in time. The first evening was serene. I unpacked, made a small fire in the outdoor pit, and sat on the porch with my book, sipping coffee from a thermos. The only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot from small forest creatures. As darkness fell, the forest silhouette became a black wall against the star-speckled sky. I felt utterly alone, but in a way that was comforting, like a soft embrace of nature. But then, around 10 p.m., something shifted. I was lying on the worn couch inside the cabin, the faint orange flicker of the fireplace casting dancing shadows on the walls, when I heard a soft thumping noise from outside. At first, I thought it was a branch hitting the cabin. The wind was picking up, rustling the leaves with increasing urgency, but the thumping persisted, steady and deliberate. I got up and peered out the window. The porch was empty, swaying gently in the breeze. I chalked it up to an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. Still, the noise unnerved me enough to shut the curtains and check the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was sealed tight. The thumping stopped. I settled back down, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Around midnight, I was woken by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, pacing just outside the cabin. It wasn't like before. These were footsteps moving slowly, pausing, then resuming. I froze, straining my ears. No rustling of leaves or branches, just the crisp crunch of boots on gravel. My heart hammered in my chest as I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the door. Peeking through the small window, I saw nothing but darkness. No figure, no movement. Yet the footsteps continued, circling the cabin in a slow rhythm, like someone walking around me, studying the place. The door creaked slightly and a cold gust blew in. I slammed it shut, backed away, and locked it again. I sat against the door, flashlight trembling in my hand. My phone screen lit up, a message from my friend. "You okay? I saw your location stop moving on the map." I typed back quickly, Yeah, just relaxing. Cabin is creepy, but cool. Minutes later, the footsteps stopped. Silence swallowed the cabin once more. The next day, I convinced myself it was a prank, or my imagination fueled by isolation. I went for a long hike to clear my mind, the dense forest stretching endlessly, but no signs of human presence anywhere. When I returned, the cabin seemed to welcome me back with the same quiet stillness. That night, I decided to sleep with the door unlocked, windows open slightly for fresh air. Maybe the closed-off feeling was what had unnerved me. Around 3 a.m., I woke again to the footsteps. This time, they were closer, just outside my bedroom window. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped, replaced by a faint whisper. It was unintelligible, almost like wind playing tricks, but then the whisper turned into a low, drawn-out sigh. The hairs on my arms stood up. I swallowed hard and flicked on the flashlight, shining it toward the window. Nothing. But then I noticed it. On the frosted glass, a faint handprint slowly fading away, as if pressed by something cold and wet. I snapped a picture, trembling, then shut the window tightly. The whispering stopped, and the footsteps retreated. The following day, shaken and uneasy, I called the cabin owner. She seemed surprised to hear from me at such an odd hour, but was polite. "Has anyone else reported anything strange?" I asked cautiously. She paused before replying. "Some folks say the land used to belong to a family who vanished decades ago. The area's been empty since. Some say their spirits linger." I felt a chill run down my spine, but laughed nervously. "Sounds like a campfire story." "Maybe," she said. "Just don't stay out there too long after dark." I thanked her and ended the call, my stomach twisting with a mix of fear and curiosity. That night, I left every light on and kept the door locked. The footsteps came again, circling, slower this time, then the whispering, clearer now, a woman's voice, soft and pleading. "Help me." I wanted to respond, to say something, anything, but my voice was trapped in my throat. The whispers faded with the first light of dawn. When I stepped outside, the forest looked harmless and inviting. But on the porch swing, a fresh handprint was etched into the dust, stark and unmistakable. I packed up quickly, my nerves fraying. As I drove away, the trees seemed to watch, silent and knowing. Back in my apartment, the photo of the handprint remained on my phone, a haunting reminder. Occasionally at night, I hear that whisper in my mind, soft, pleading, forever echoing. Story the end. I had been planning the solo trip for months. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from the city noise, an opportunity to recharge, clear my mind, and maybe reconnect with something deeper inside myself. I had no interest in crowded tourist spots or well-known destinations. Instead, I chose a remote stretch of forest in the Pacific Northwest, a place few people visited and where cell phone reception was spotty at best. The first 2 days went exactly as I hoped. The hike was challenging but rewarding. The towering evergreens, moss-covered rocks, and endless canopy above created a kind of timelessness. I found a small clearing beside a creek, pitched my tent, and settled in for the night. The air was crisp, the silence nearly complete, except for the soft babbling of the water and the occasional call of an owl. On the third night, something changed. I had gone to bed early, feeling the fatigue from the long hike. The tent's thin fabric muffled the outside world, but I was still aware of the sounds of the forest, wind shifting the branches, distant animal calls. I was drifting off when I noticed something unusual. A faint tapping, rhythmic and slow, coming from outside the tent. It wasn't the usual wildlife sounds. It was deliberate, like someone or something was tapping on the outside of my tent. I froze, listening. The tapping continued, soft, measured, deliberate. I told myself it was probably a branch brushing against the tent or maybe some animal knocking on a rock, but the pattern felt too consistent. It wasn't random. Summoning my courage, I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer out into the darkness. The moon was thin, casting faint light, but I saw nothing. No animals, no humans. The tapping stopped as soon as I opened the tent, replaced by a heavy silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I decided to shake it off and zip the tent closed again. Lying back down, I tried to focus on my breathing. After a few minutes, I thought I heard a whisper, so faint it might have been my imagination, coming from the edge of the trees. "Help me." I sat up instantly, heart pounding. The whisper repeated, just barely audible, "Help me." It sounded so fragile, desperate. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent fully. The forest was still, too still. The only sound was the creek nearby. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing. My logical mind kept telling me it was an animal, or maybe the wind creating odd sounds. But the voice chilled me to the core. I stepped outside, shining my light to the darkness. The beam illuminated a path leading deeper into the woods, one I hadn't explored yet. Against my better judgment, I followed it. The path was narrow and twisted, the trees closing in tightly. My flashlight beam bounced over thick moss and twisted roots. After a few minutes, I reached a small clearing I hadn't noticed before. There at the center was a crumbling stone well, covered in moss and vines, almost hidden from sight. I approached cautiously, shining the light down into the well. The darkness inside seemed bottomless. The whispering voice returned, barely audible, coming from below. "Help me." A cold shiver ran down my spine. Something about the place felt wrong, ancient, and sorrowful. I wanted to leave, but curiosity kept me rooted there, frozen in place. Suddenly I heard a splash. Something had fallen or been thrown into the well. I took a step back and tripped over a root, falling hard onto the ground. My flashlight skittered out of my hand and rolled into the bushes, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged. I scrambled to find the flashlight, hands trembling. When I finally grabbed it and flicked it back on, the beam caught movement in the shadows. A figure, or something that looked like a figure, standing just at the edge of the clearing, watching me. It was pale and gaunt, its eyes hollow and black. It didn't move, but the air around it seemed to chill, like a sudden frost. I scrambled backwards, heart racing, and sprinted back along the path to my tent. I didn't look back. Inside the tent, I locked the flap and huddled in my sleeping bag, the flashlight clutched tightly. I couldn't sleep. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound magnified. The tapping started again, soft, steady, like a heartbeat on the tent fabric. The next morning, I debated whether to cut the trip short, but the wilderness was my escape, and despite the terror, I didn't want to give up. I packed up and decided to hike out, but something felt off. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. It was like the woods themselves were holding their breath. As I walked, I noticed strange markings on the trees, scratches that looked old but unnerving. They resembled tally marks, but uneven, like someone was counting days or something worse. My path took me past the clearing with the well, and I stopped, staring down into its dark mouth. I could swear I saw movement again, a flicker of pale skin just below the rim. I swallowed hard and kept moving. Back at my car, I tried to relax, but the feeling of being watched never left me. On the drive home, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You left her behind." I froze. The hairs on my arms stood up. I wanted to believe it was a prank, but the voice from the night, the tapping, the well, it all came rushing back. That night, back in my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me from the woods. The tapping started again. Faint, insistent, coming from inside my closet. I never went back to that forest, but sometimes late at night I swear I hear that whisper again, and the tapping won't stop. Story the end. I set out on the solo trip with a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. I'd always wanted to experience the solitude of the mountains, away from the noise and constant buzz of the city. After months of planning, I chose a remote cabin deep in the forest, accessible only by a narrow, winding dirt road that few travelers dared to take. The cabin was rustic but cozy, with no electricity and just a wood-burning stove for heat. I wanted to disconnect completely. No phones, no internet, just nature and me. The first day was peaceful. I hiked the nearby trails, soaked in the towering trees, and sat quietly by the river watching the water flow. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and the world felt timeless. That night, after a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, I sat outside on the porch wrapped in a blanket, staring up at the stars, feeling small but oddly comforted. The silence was profound. On the second night, the atmosphere shifted. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a strange noise, a low, rhythmic tapping coming from the side of the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to hear. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone knocking on wood, but it wasn't the door or window. It sounded like it was coming from the forest itself, right outside the cabin wall. I grabbed my flashlight and swung the beam around, but the trees stood still and dark in the moonlight. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had started. I told myself it was probably a branch falling or a woodpecker, but sleep didn't come easily after that. The forest felt different, alive in a way I hadn't noticed before, as if it was watching me. The next day I tried to shake off the unease. I went for a longer hike, hoping the exercise would clear my mind. The woods were dense and quiet, the trail twisting in and out of shadows. After about an hour, I came across an old, abandoned cabin ruin. The wood was rotted and covered in moss, the roof partially collapsed. Curiosity pulled me closer, and I noticed strange carvings etched into the doorframe, lines and symbols I didn't recognize. I felt a chill run down my spine, but shrugged it off as just the eerie remnants of a forgotten homestead. When I returned to my cabin, I found the front door slightly ajar. I was sure I'd locked it before leaving. My heart raced as I stepped inside, scanning every corner. Nothing seemed disturbed, no footprints, no signs of forced entry. I locked the door again, double-checked the windows, and tried to calm myself. That night was worse. I heard whispering, faint, indistinct voices that seemed to circle the cabin. I pressed my ear to the wall and heard what sounded like low chanting. The tapping returned, this time accompanied by a cold draft that blew out my candle. I relit it quickly and wrapped myself in my blanket, fighting panic. I couldn't explain the sounds, but they weren't natural. By the third day, I felt trapped. The forest around me felt hostile and alive with unseen eyes. I was determined to leave at dawn, but as I packed my bag late that night, I noticed a figure standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was a woman in a long, tattered dress, pale and thin, her dark hair tangled and hanging over her face. I froze, unsure if I was dreaming or hallucinating. When I blinked, she vanished. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow shaped by the moonlight, but deep down, I knew what I'd seen wasn't human. I grabbed my things and fled into the darkness, stumbling down the trail toward my car. As I reached the dirt road, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, matching my pace. I dared not look back. The footsteps stopped when I started running. When I finally reached my car and locked the doors, relief washed over me. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw her again. The woman standing at the tree line, watching me with empty eyes. I didn't wait another second. I started the engine and sped down the winding road without looking back. That night, safe in a motel miles away, I tried to make sense of it. The locals I spoke to mentioned old legends about a woman who vanished in those woods decades ago. Her spirit said to haunt the forest, luring travelers into the trees. I didn't believe in ghosts before, but what I experienced was real, terrifyingly real. Even now, months later, sometimes I wake up in the dark, hearing tapping on the walls and whispering in the silence. And I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for the next traveler to wander too far into her domain. Story the end. The idea had always been simple. Take a solo trip into the wilderness, away from the noise of the city, the constant buzzing of notifications, and the crowd that never really let you breathe. I wasn't a believer in ghosts or the supernatural. My skepticism was rooted in logic, science, and what I could touch and see. Still, there was something about this old cabin in the woods, tucked away deep in the Allegheny National Forest, that drew me. The listing said it was isolated, off the grid, perfect for solitude and reflection, just what I needed. I packed light, a tent, a sleeping bag, food for a few days, a first aid kit, a portable stove, and my camera. I'd been wanting to document some quiet landscapes anyway. I booked a car rental, drove for hours, and finally found the narrow dirt road that led up to the cabin. It was dusk when I arrived, the last faint rays of sunlight threading through the dense canopy of ancient trees. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. The cabin itself was old, made of dark wood weathered by decades of rain and snow. The windows were dusty, the porch creaked under my weight, and there was a rusted metal sign nailed near the door with the name Hawthorne Cabin, barely legible. The key was taped under the welcome mat, something the owner had mentioned in an email. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately noticed the chill. It wasn't just the cold air. It felt like the walls were holding a weight, a presence. Inside, the cabin was sparse, a wood stove, a small table, a couple of chairs, and a bookshelf lined with old yellowed books. I unpacked quickly, lit a small fire in the stove, and settled down with a cup of instant coffee. The night was quiet, but not peaceful. The kind of quiet that feels watchful, as if the forest itself is holding its breath. I shrugged off the unease, telling myself it was just my imagination, the nerves of being alone in an unfamiliar place. The first night passed without incident, though I barely slept. Every creak, every snap of a twig outside made me jump. When morning came, I stepped outside with my camera and wandered the trails nearby, photographing the twisted roots and moss-covered rocks. The forest was stunning, the sunlight dappling through the leaves, but there was still something off. I kept catching glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision, shadows that vanished when I looked directly. The second night is when things started to get truly strange. It began with a sound, a soft tapping at the window. I was reading by the fire when I heard it, slow and deliberate, like fingers drumming against the glass. I froze and looked over. Nothing was there. Maybe a branch, but the rhythm was too precise, too human. I moved closer, heart pounding, and the tapping stopped. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon or a bird. I didn't want to think about anything else. Then later that night, I heard footsteps on the porch, heavy, slow steps pacing back and forth. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and stayed perfectly still, eyes fixed on the door. After a few minutes, the footsteps stopped. The silence pressed in again. I finally mustered the courage to get up and check outside. No footprints in the soft earth, no sign of anyone or anything. But then the door was slightly ajar. I was sure I'd locked it. My heart hammered as I pushed it closed and double-locked it. I spent the rest of the night with the fire blazing, watching every shadow flicker on the walls. I didn't sleep. By dawn, I was exhausted, but determined to stay. I told myself it was just the stress playing tricks on me. A few old trees creaking in the wind, a loose latch on the door, nothing more. But when I went to get water from the small pump outside, I found something that chilled me to my core. On the ground beneath the window where I'd heard the tapping, someone or something had drawn a symbol in the dirt. A circle with jagged lines inside, like a star but crooked and imperfect. I stared at it, trying to convince myself it was just an animal's scratch marks. But I knew better. No animal could have made that shape with such intent. I photographed the symbol with my camera, then scoured the internet to see if it matched any known signs. Nothing came up. It wasn't a common pagan symbol or something from folklore I could find. It was something else. That afternoon, I stayed inside the cabin, avoiding the trails. I kept the windows shut and the fire going. When night fell, the tapping started again, but this time it was joined by whispers. Soft, incomprehensible murmurs that seemed to come from just beyond the walls. I strained to hear words, but they were too low, like someone speaking behind a thick veil. Suddenly, the fire sputtered and died. The room plunged into darkness except for the faint glow of the moon through the window. The whispers grew louder, circling around me, as if the forest had come alive to speak just to me. My breath came in short gasps. I grabbed my phone, but no signal. The battery was low, and I couldn't use it as a flashlight. The tapping turned into frantic pounding, and the whispers crescendoed into guttural voices, overlapping and rising in a terrifying chorus. Then silence. A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candle I had lit. The hairs on my arms stood on end as I heard the unmistakable sound of breathing right next to me. I whipped my head toward the dark corner near the door, but saw only shadows. I bolted outside, into the cold night air, and didn't stop running until I reached my car. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the dirt road without looking back. When I returned home, I showed the photos to a local historian who specialized in the area. He looked at the symbol and paled. "That's an old marking," he said quietly. "It's linked to a series of disappearances and strange deaths around here over 100 years ago. People said it was cursed ground, haunted by those who never left." I never went back to the cabin. The photos still haunt me, especially the ones from the second night, where in the corner of one frame, a faint figure seems to peer out from the shadows, its eyes glowing faintly. My skepticism shattered that night, replaced by a deep and lingering fear. Sometimes I wonder if it was real or just my mind breaking down in isolation. But I know one thing for certain. Some places are better left alone. Story, the end. I had always been the kind of person who liked to travel alone. There's a quiet thrill in navigating new places by yourself, in figuring things out on your own terms. No compromises, no distractions. It's just you and the world. So when I got the chance to take a solo trip to a small mountain town in the Pacific Northwest, I jumped at it. The place was called Ashwood. Nestled deep in the forested hills, it was the kind of town that seemed frozen in time, with a population barely breaking a few hundred. The locals were friendly but reserved, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. I arrived late afternoon in late October, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the tall firs. The drive up had been winding, the roads narrow and slick with fallen leaves and a light drizzle. I checked into a small cabin I had booked weeks earlier, right on the outskirts of town, close to the forest. It was simple, a one-room cabin with a wood stove, a bed, a small kitchenette, and a porch that overlooked the dense trees. Perfect for disconnecting. The first night passed quietly. I spent it reading by the fire, the rain tapping gently on the tin roof. The silence of the forest was profound, only broken by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant call of a coyote. I slept soundly, waking early to the soft gray light filtering through the window. The plan was to spend my days hiking, exploring old trails, and maybe doing a bit of journaling in the evenings. I had read that Ashwood was known for a few abandoned sites, old logging camps, and a deserted fire lookout tower about 5 miles from town. I decided I'd try to visit the lookout the next day. The morning started off clear, crisp, with that fresh mountain chill. I packed my backpack with water, snacks, a map, my camera, and a flashlight just in case. The trailhead was easy to find, marked by a weathered wooden sign partially obscured by moss. The path wound uphill through thick woods, the trees gradually thinning as I climbed. The air was cool and still, and I enjoyed the solitude as I made my way up. About 2 hours in, the trail split and I took the left fork, which was said to lead directly to the old lookout tower. It wasn't maintained anymore, and the last few visitors reported it was dangerous to climb, but I was curious. Besides, I wasn't planning on climbing it, just checking it out. The forest here was quieter, the trees spaced farther apart. The ground was littered with pine needles, and here and there I spotted patches of wild mushrooms and the remains of small animals, probably squirrels or rabbits. The air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. I shrugged off the feeling and pressed on. When I finally reached the tower, it was a rusted metal skeleton standing on a small clearing at the summit. The wooden stairs had mostly rotted away, and vines crawled up the sides. I took a few photos, admiring the view, rolling hills and endless trees fading into the gray horizon. As I turned to head back, I noticed something odd, a faint figure standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, between the trees. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but the figure didn't move. It was pale, almost translucent, wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothing, something from the 1930s maybe. I blinked hard and looked again, but the figure was gone. My heart rate picked up, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a tree stump or a shadow. I snapped a quick picture of the spot where I'd seen it and hurried back down the trail. Back at the cabin, I checked the photo on my camera. It was grainy and dark, but when I zoomed in, I could make out a faint shape, indistinct, but definitely humanoid. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The cabin was quiet, except for the crackling fire and the rain that had started again. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, pacing just beyond the porch. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed my flashlight. Shining it into the darkness, I saw nothing but swaying branches and the dense blackness of the forest. I called out, but no answer came. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the only sound was my own breathing. Then a soft whisper, barely audible, seemed to drift through the air. "Leave." I froze. The voice was faint, but unmistakably a woman's, sad and cold. I grabbed my jacket and phone, deciding to go for a walk, hoping to clear my head. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air was thick and damp. The forest seemed alive, whispering secrets just beyond hearing. As I walked down the narrow path leading away from the cabin, I noticed something else. Small stones arranged in a circle by the side of the trail, like a crude altar. In the center lay a faded photograph, yellowed and torn. I picked it up and recognized the same woman I had seen at the lookout tower, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, smiling sadly. Suddenly, I felt the temperature drop sharply. my breath visible in the cold air. The whisper came again, louder this time, more urgent. "Don't stay." I turned to run, but the path behind me was gone. Thick fog had rolled in, swallowing the trail and blurring the trees into ghostly shapes. Panic surged through me as I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction looked the same. I called out for help, but my voice was swallowed by the mist. Then I heard it. Soft crying coming from just beyond the fog. I moved toward the sound, drawn by a mix of fear and pity. The crying grew louder, more desperate, but every time I stepped closer, it seemed to retreat. I stumbled into a small clearing, and there she was, the woman from the photograph standing with her back to me. Her dress was tattered, stained with dirt, and her hair hung in tangled strands. She slowly turned around, revealing hollow eyes that seemed to hold the weight of decades. "Why are you here?" she whispered, voice trembling. "I'm just visiting," I said, voice shaking. She looked at me with something between sorrow and warning. "This place, it's not safe, not for the living." Before I could respond, a sharp wind whipped through the trees, tearing the fog away and revealing the path again. The woman began to fade, her form dissolving into mist. "Remember me," she said, her voice barely audible as she disappeared. I ran back to the cabin as fast as I could, not daring to look back. When I locked the door behind me, I found my phone had no signal. The photograph was still in my hand. I spent the rest of the night huddled by the fire, trying to make sense of what had happened. When morning came, the sun burned away the fog, and the forest returned to its usual peacefulness. But the photograph remained, a haunting reminder. Before leaving Ashwood the next day, I stopped by the local library to look through old records. I found a small article dated 1934 about a young woman named Clara Whitmore who had disappeared near the Lookout Tower. She was a logger's daughter, known to wander the forest alone. Her body was never found. Some locals told me stories about strange sightings around the tower, ghostly figures, whispered warnings, cold spots where no warmth could be felt. They said the forest held memories of the past, and sometimes those memories reached out to the living. I left Ashwood with a heavy heart and an uneasy feeling that I had been marked by something beyond explanation. The photo remains with me to this day, its edges frayed and its image growing dimmer. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I swear I hear a soft whisper on the wind. Leave. Story. The end. I planned the solo trip to the remote mountain cabin with the idea of escaping everything, work stress, city noise, the constant buzz of social media, just me, the woods, and silence. I had been hiking before, but this time I wanted something different, a real retreat. No internet, no phone signal, just nature and solitude. I booked a small old cabin deep in the Appalachians, one that looked like it hadn't changed much in decades. The drive there was long but peaceful. I passed a few tiny towns, mostly empty storefronts and weathered signs. The last stretch was a dirt road twisting up through thick forest. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the hills, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin was small, wooden, and a bit worn. It had a porch with a creaky swing and a rusty old lantern hanging by the door. Inside, there was a single room with a wood stove, a bed with a faded quilt, and a small kitchen area. It smelled faintly of dust and pine. There was no phone reception as promised. Perfect. The first night was quiet, maybe too quiet. I sat on the porch swing sipping coffee, watching the stars pop out one by one. It was beautiful, but a little eerie. The woods felt alive in a way I hadn't expected, like they were watching. I shrugged it off and went inside early. Inside, the wind made the cabin creak and groan, but I told myself it was just an old building, settling. I lay down to sleep, but it took a while. Every little sound outside made me jump. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it, a soft tapping, like fingernails lightly knocking on the cabin door. I froze, heart pounding. The knocking stopped. I told myself it was an animal or a branch knocking in the wind. After a few minutes, I managed to fall back asleep. The next day, I tried to shake off the weird feeling. I explored nearby trails, took photos of the wildflowers and the creek, even tried to catch some fish. The woods were beautiful in daylight, and the strange noises from the night before seemed far away. That night, though, things got worse. Around midnight, I was woken by the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving around the perimeter. My heart was racing. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly moved to the window, peeking out into the darkness. The beam of the flashlight cut through the night, but I saw nothing. No shape, no figure, nothing moving. Then I heard whispering, almost like a breathy conversation, just beyond the tree line. It was unintelligible, but definitely voices. I clicked off the flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, trying to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped. The whispering faded. I stayed up for hours, clutching a kitchen knife for some semblance of security. The next morning, I found strange marks on the porch floor. Scratches, almost like claw marks, but longer and deeper. I couldn't explain them. There were no animals large enough around, and nothing seemed disturbed inside the cabin. I wanted to leave. I debated it all morning, but I had come so far, and I kept telling myself it was all in my head. Maybe a local prank or my imagination playing tricks in the dark. So I stayed. That afternoon, I set out for a hike up to an old lookout point I'd read about. The trail was narrow and overgrown. About halfway, I found a small clearing with an old stone altar, weathered and moss-covered, oddly out of place. The air felt heavy and cold, even though the sun was shining. As I approached the altar, I heard a faint voice behind me. It was a woman's voice, whispering, calling my name. I whipped around, but no one was there, just the trees swaying in the wind. I shivered and decided to head back. When I returned to the cabin, the sun was setting again and the shadows were stretching across the yard. That night was the worst. I lay in bed, barely able to breathe. The knocking returned, more insistent this time, and the footsteps were louder, circling the cabin repeatedly. The whispering grew into murmurs, almost chanting. I got up and lit the old lantern. The flickering light threw strange shadows on the walls. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, something moving just outside the window. A pale face, gaunt and expressionless, staring straight at me. I screamed and backed away. The face vanished. I ran outside, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness. Nothing. The woods were still. Silent. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I packed my things, ready to leave. But as I tried to start the car, it wouldn't turn over. No power. My phone was dead, no signal. I was stuck. Panic set in. I went back to the cabin and tried to calm myself. Then I heard it. Soft footsteps coming from inside. I wasn't alone. I grabbed the knife and searched every room. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched never left. That evening, I sat on the porch trying to make sense of it all when the face appeared again, closer this time. Its eyes were empty, black pits. I felt a cold wave wash over me. Suddenly, the face smiled, a wide, unnatural grin revealing rows of sharp teeth. I stumbled back inside, locked the door, and hid in the bedroom. Hours passed. The noises outside grew frantic, banging on the walls, scratching at the windows. The face pressed up against the glass, staring in. At dawn, everything stopped. I finally managed to start the car. I didn't look back as I sped down the dirt road, the sun rising behind me. Back in town, I tried to tell people what happened, but they just smiled and said the cabin had been empty for years, with no record of any caretaker or visitor. Some locals whispered that the land was cursed, haunted by a woman who vanished there decades ago. I never went back, and I never told anyone everything I saw that night. But sometimes when I'm alone, I still hear faint tapping on my door or a whisper calling my name on the wind. Story, the end. I took a solo trip to northern Maine in September of last year, needing a break from work and people in general. I'd never traveled alone before, but something about the idea was comforting, liberating even. I booked a secluded cabin through an obscure rental website. The pictures showed a modest wooden structure nestled at the edge of a thick forest beside a lake, with no visible neighbors in sight. It looked perfect. The owner, an older woman named Ellen, messaged me once before my arrival, giving simple instructions. The key would be under the welcome mat, the water was well-based, so be conservative, and cell reception was spotty at best. She added a brief line that struck me as odd. If you hear scratching on the windows at night, do not look out. I assumed it was some quirky local superstition or maybe her way of messing with tourists. Still, I chuckled, saved her message, and didn't think twice about it. The drive took over 6 hours. The last 40 minutes were on a dirt road riddled with potholes and lined with tall, skeletal pine trees that looked like they hadn't seen sunlight in a decade. My car struggled the last few miles, tires crunching over gravel and fallen branches. There were no houses, no other cars, no people. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the photos. Small, but clean. There was a dock leading into the lake and a fire pit surrounded by stumps. The air was brisk but refreshing, and all I could hear were distant bird calls and the rustle of wind through trees. For the first time in months, I felt peaceful. The first 2 days were uneventful. I hiked during the day, cooked over a small stove, read paperbacks, and took notes in my journal. At night, I'd sit on the dock with a flashlight and a drink, watching the stars blink above the black water. On the third night, things changed. I was in bed by 10 p.m., wrapped in a flannel blanket, with the cabin silent around me. I'd left the fireplace burning low and the curtains drawn, hoping to wake up early for a sunrise hike. At some point in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a faint tapping sound. It was soft, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. At first, I thought it was a tree branch brushing the side of the cabin. But as I blinked in the dark and focused, it became clear it was coming from the window near the kitchen. The sound wasn't random. It had a strange cadence to it, as if it was being made intentionally. I sat up, heart beginning to race. I told myself it was nothing, probably an animal, a raccoon or something. I stayed frozen for a few minutes, listening. Then it stopped. The silence returned. But just as I started to relax, it came again, this time louder and from a different window. This one was behind me, near the back of the cabin. Tap, tap, tap. I remembered Ellen's message, suddenly not so funny anymore. If you hear scratching on the windows at night, do not look out. I swallowed hard, debating what to do. My phone had no signal. There was no landline. The closest town was at least 20 miles away. I sat there in the dark, clutching the blanket, trying to ignore it. Eventually, the tapping stopped again, and I must have dozed off from sheer exhaustion, because the next thing I knew, morning sunlight was streaming through the window. Trying to rationalize it, I blamed the wind or small forest animals. I tried to forget about it. After all, it was a beautiful morning. I went on my hike, took pictures, and spent the afternoon reading by the lake. But that night, it came back. This time, it started around 1 a.m. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it wasn't soft. It was insistent, aggressive. Tap, 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 tap. It came from the front window. Then the side. Then the back. I got out of bed slowly, grabbed the fire poker from the fireplace, and crept toward the window by the kitchen. The tapping stopped again, just before I got close. I wanted to peek out. My hand was already reaching for the curtain. But I stopped. Don't look out. That phrase repeated in my mind like a warning. My hand trembled. Instead of looking, I backed away and turned on every light in the cabin. Nothing. No shadows, no movement outside. Just a dense curtain of trees and darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I found something that chilled me to my core. On the ground outside the front window were strange markings. Not footprints, more like dragging patterns, as if someone had scraped long, sharp sticks through the dirt in looping, erratic lines. Almost like symbols, but not any I recognized. The soil was disturbed, clawed even. I took a photo, though I wasn't sure why. That afternoon, I considered leaving. But the road was rough, and my tank was barely half full. I'd have to drive back through miles of forest before even reaching a gas station. I told myself I could stick it out one more night. I set up noise machines on my phone, kept all the lights on, and placed the fire poker next to my bed. It didn't help. At 2:17 a.m., I was awakened by more than tapping. It was a voice right outside the window by my bed. "Can I come in?" it whispered. The voice was thin, dry, female, like someone mimicking speech with vocal cords that hadn't been used in decades. I froze. My throat clenched shut. The whisper came again, louder, more desperate. "Let me in." I stared at the curtain. A small part of me screamed to look out, to see who it was, to confront whatever this was. But something deeper inside me, something primal, screamed louder. "Don't look." I slid out of bed and crawled across the room on my hands and knees. I reached for the poker with shaking fingers. The voice continued, circling the cabin. "You see me. Don't pretend you don't see me. I saw you looking earlier. I hadn't looked. I swear I hadn't." But the voice didn't stop. Eventually, after what felt like hours, the whispers ceased. The last thing I heard was a long, guttural groan, like someone exhaling their final breath. I stayed crouched on the floor until dawn. When I finally dared to peek out through a gap in the curtain, there was nothing, just the still lake and a few leaves swirling in the wind. But when I opened the front door, I saw that the dragging symbols had returned. This time they were more deliberate, forming a full circle around the cabin. Inside the circle, carved into the dirt directly in front of the steps, were two words, "Look now." That was enough. I grabbed my bag, left everything else behind, and got into my car. The engine groaned as it started, but it got me out of there. The whole drive back, I felt like something was watching me. I couldn't shake it. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I expected to see something sitting in the back seat, but there was never anything there. Once I got home, I tried to contact Ellen through the rental site. Her profile was gone. No trace of the cabin listing, no email replies, nothing. I checked the site's archived listings, but it was like it had never existed. I even went so far as to look up county property records for the area. According to those, there hasn't been a cabin at that address for over 30 years. It had burned down in the late 80s. The land was considered unsafe and left undeveloped. There was even a note in the record stating that multiple hikers had gone missing in the area over the years, but no remains were ever found. I haven't traveled alone since. I still wake up sometimes at night to the sound of tapping, and every now and then I hear that voice again. Faint, almost drowned by sleep. Let me in. And even now, after everything, I still haven't looked. Story the end. I had always been someone who craved solitude, the kind that only a solo trip to a remote place could satisfy. No distractions, no noise, just me and nature. So when I decided to take a week off and hike the old abandoned trail near the outskirts of a small mountain town, it felt like the perfect escape. I wanted to disconnect from the constant buzz of city life and just be alone with my thoughts. The trail was something I found almost by accident, reading about it on a forum where hikers shared less-known paths. It was called Hollow Creek Trail. People said it was beautiful but eerie, stories of strange sounds and unexplained sightings. I didn't believe any of it. I chalked it up to local folklore, the kind of ghost stories people tell to make a place seem more interesting. I packed light, just essentials and my camera, and set out early on a Saturday morning. The first day went smoothly. The trail was surrounded by dense forest, thick trees stretching up toward the sky. The creek ran alongside in certain parts, water bubbling quietly over rocks. Birds chirped. The air smelled fresh and earthy. I felt my stress melting away as I walked deeper into the woods. There was no cell phone service, but that was fine. I wanted this. As evening approached, I found a small clearing with a flat patch of ground perfect for setting up my tent. I made a quick dinner on my portable stove, took some photos of the sunset, and settled in for the night. The forest was quiet except for the occasional hoot of an owl or rustling of leaves. I felt completely safe. But then, around 2 a.m., I woke up. The wind had picked up, whistling softly through the trees. At first, it was just the wind, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was rain hitting the tent, but the sky was clear. The tapping was deliberate, like someone gently knocking on wood. My heart started racing, and I froze, trying to listen carefully. The sound seemed to be coming from just outside the tent, near the edge of the clearing. I didn't want to get up and look, but I also didn't want to ignore it. After a few seconds, the tapping stopped. I convinced myself it was probably a branch hitting the tent in the wind. I told myself this was just the forest noises playing tricks on me and tried to fall back asleep. But every time I closed my eyes, the tapping would come back, faint and slow, almost like a soft heartbeat. By dawn, I was exhausted and unsettled. The morning light helped calm my nerves a bit, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I packed up my tent quickly and continued along the trail, hoping the next campsite would feel safer. Later that afternoon, I reached an old ranger station, long abandoned, boarded up and overgrown with vines. I was curious and decided to take some photos. As I walked around the station, I noticed old carvings on the wooden door, names, dates, and strange symbols I didn't recognize. One carving caught my eye. The date was from the 1920s, and below it was a name, Eleanor. The handwriting looked hurried, almost desperate. That night, I camped near the edge of a small pond. The water was still and dark, reflecting the stars above. I was so tired I didn't care about the earlier tapping noise anymore. I told myself I was imagining things, stressed out from being alone. Around midnight, something woke me again. This time, it wasn't tapping. It was a soft whispering, so faint I could barely hear it. I couldn't make out any words, just a gentle rustle that sounded like someone speaking directly into the night air. My blood ran cold. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding, straining to hear. The whispering stopped as suddenly as it started. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it around the clearing, but there was no one there. Trying to rationalize, I thought maybe it was the wind playing tricks or some small animals near the pond. I told myself I was tired and overreacting. I closed my eyes and finally fell asleep. The next morning, I woke to a thick fog hanging low over the pond. I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the muddy ground around the water. They looked old, but fresh enough to be recent. The strange part was they were small, delicate, almost like children's footprints. And they didn't lead anywhere. They stopped abruptly at the water's edge. I felt a chill and quickly moved on, telling myself to ignore it. The third day was supposed to be my last on the trail before heading back to town. The path narrowed and twisted through dense underbrush. The forest grew darker and quieter, and the feeling of being watched crept back in. I was exhausted but eager to get out. That evening, I set up camp in a small hollow surrounded by tall pine trees. As the sun set, the woods became oppressive. The usual night sounds faded, replaced by an eerie silence that felt unnatural. Just before midnight, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching on dry leaves nearby. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness. The beam landed on a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. She was a woman, pale and thin, wearing an old-fashioned white dress that fluttered in the breeze. Her hair was long and tangled, obscuring her face. I called out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she just stared at me silently. My voice shook as I asked if she needed help. The woman didn't move or speak. Then, suddenly, she vanished, as if swallowed by the darkness. I sat frozen, heart hammering. I packed my things as fast as I could and decided to hike back immediately. The walk back was terrifying. Every shadow seemed alive. Every rustle made me jump. I kept hearing faint whispers and tapping noises following me through the trees. When I finally reached the ranger station again, I stopped, unable to look away from the door with the name Eleanor carved into it. I remembered the woman in white, her dress the same style as the carvings were old. I pulled out my phone, hoping for a signal. When it finally came through, I searched Eleanor Hollow Creek. I found an old article about a woman named Eleanor Crawford who had disappeared in the area in 1923. She was rumored to have been mentally ill, wandering the woods until she was never seen again. Locals said her spirit haunted the trail, searching for help that never came. I swallowed hard, my skin prickling with cold sweat. That night, back at a small motel in town, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the sounds, the tapping, the whispers, and the woman in white. I wondered if I had really seen a ghost or if the isolation and fear had played tricks on me. But then, when I looked at the photos I'd taken on the trail, my blood ran cold. Among the pictures of trees and creek were several images of a pale woman in a white dress. She wasn't standing there when I took the shots. She was blurry and translucent, almost like a double exposure, but I hadn't moved the camera. In some photos, her face was clear, hollow eyes staring right at me. I deleted the photos in a panic, but the images stayed burned in my mind. I never went back to Hollow Creek Trail. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that tapping in my head, steady and slow, like a ghostly heartbeat reminding me that some stories are real. Story the end. I'd been planning the solo trip for months, one of those bucket list things. Just me, my old Jeep, and a route winding through the Pacific Northwest. Dense forests, misty mountain passes, and winding rivers. I was burned out at work, sick of people, and honestly just wanted silence. Solitude. It sounded romantic in a way, freeing, even a little spiritual. I picked out a string of small towns and remote campgrounds along the way, places off the grid. One particular spot, Barlow Ridge, caught my attention online. It wasn't listed on the typical travel forums, just a random blog entry I found from a guy who said it was undisturbed, pure wilderness. That was enough for me. I got there on a Tuesday evening around 6 p.m. The sky was beginning to dim, and the air smelled like pine and moss. There was no signage, no official park map, just a dirt path off a county road and a rusted gate that stood permanently open. The trail that led into the woods was barely wide enough for my Jeep. I drove in about a mile until I found a small clearing near a narrow creek. I parked, pitched my tent, and started a small fire. No cell service, no noise besides insects and birds, and not a single soul around. It was perfect. That night was uneventful. Cool, calm. I lay in my tent listening to the chirps and rustling of the woods. Sometime around midnight, I thought I heard something moving outside, like footsteps in the leaves. I sat up, held my breath, but it passed quickly, and I told myself it was just a raccoon or a deer. Nothing worth getting worked up about. The second day I spent hiking, taking pictures, exploring deeper into the forest. I found old logging roads, remnants of cabins long overtaken by moss and vines. It gave me an eerie feeling, like the forest had eaten whatever had once lived there. But I chalked it up to the natural decay of old structures. Things get abandoned. Life moves on. That night, I had a harder time sleeping. The air had turned colder, unnaturally so. I was wrapped up in my sleeping bag, but it felt like the chill was sinking into my bones. Around 2 a.m., I heard those same footsteps again, only this time they stopped just outside my tent. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Whoever it was didn't say a word. The steps were soft, deliberate, not wandering, but like they knew exactly where I was. After what felt like 10 minutes, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek through. Nothing. Just darkness and trees. I sat up for a while, gripping my flashlight and listening, but I never heard the footsteps again. I didn't sleep until dawn. I decided to cut my stay at Barlow Ridge short. I packed up quickly, eager to get back to the road, but when I turned the key in the Jeep, nothing. It didn't even click. Battery was fine, headlights worked, it just refused to start. I tried for over an hour, checking every obvious thing I could think of, but nothing made sense. It was like the engine had just given up. The trail was too narrow to get a tow truck in there, and I hadn't seen another person in 2 days. My only option was to walk back to the county road and hope I could flag someone down. I locked up the Jeep, took my backpack, and started hiking out. The sun was high by then, but the trail felt darker than before, the trees thicker. At one point I looked over my shoulder and could have sworn I saw a figure behind me. Just a flash of pale skin between the trees, gone as soon as I blinked. I told myself it was my imagination. That isolation was messing with my head. But then about 30 minutes into the walk, I heard whispering. Clear, crisp whispering. Multiple voices, too low to make out words. I froze, scanning the trees. No one. Nothing moved, yet the voices didn't stop. They circled around me like they were coming from all directions at once. Then they stopped. I don't know how long I stood there, heart pounding, but when I finally moved again, I walked fast. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I made it to the road by late afternoon, feet blistered, legs shaking. I stood at the edge for maybe 20 minutes before a pickup came by. I flagged it down, and the driver, a local guy named Carl, gave me a ride to the next town. He was friendly, curious about what I was doing out there, and when I told him I was at Barlow Ridge, he fell quiet. "You know that place used to be off limits back in the 80s, he said. Forest Service shut it down after some people went missing. A couple hikers, then a kid. They said it was wildlife, but..." He trailed off and didn't say anything more for a while. They tore down the signs eventually. Most folks around here stay away from it. I asked him if he believed in ghosts. He didn't answer right away. "Not ghosts," he said slowly, "but there's something out there, something that doesn't like to be disturbed." We got to town and he dropped me at a motel. I thanked him and tried to shake off the whole thing, told myself it was just an old man's stories mixed with my overactive imagination. But that night, in that musty motel room, I had a dream. I was back at the clearing in the woods. The fire was out and the sky was pitch black. I was lying in the tent and someone was outside again. Only this time I could see their shadow through the fabric. It was tall, impossibly tall, hunched over like it didn't have a spine. It didn't move like a person, just sort of jerked in unnatural twitches. I couldn't breathe. My chest was heavy. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. Then it leaned closer to the tent and whispered something. It wasn't English. It didn't sound like any language I knew, just a string of guttural sounds and hisses. But in the dream, I understood it. It said, "You were not invited." I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, gasping like I'd been underwater. I packed up and left the motel before sunrise, didn't even stop for breakfast. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something back with me, that had followed me from the woods. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening at home. At first, it was small, lights flickering, objects shifting. I'd set my keys down on the kitchen counter and find them in the bathroom. The microwave would turn on by itself. My dog, Bella, would bark at empty corners of the room and refuse to go near the back door. Then one night, I woke up at exactly 2:17 a.m. My bedroom was ice cold, and Bella was growling low and steady. I sat up and followed her gaze. At the foot of my bed was a figure. Same height, same twitchy movements from the dream. No face. Just a void where a face should have been. I couldn't move. It just stood there watching. I felt like my skin was crawling off my body. Then it whispered again. That same phrase. "You were not invited." I blacked out. I don't know how else to explain it. One moment I was staring at it, frozen. The next I woke up on the floor, sunlight pouring in through the window, Bella whimpering in the corner. After that, I didn't go home. I couldn't. I stayed with my sister for a while. But even she said I wasn't the same. She told me I talked in my sleep, whispered things, sometimes even laughed. Once she said she woke up in the middle of the night and found me standing at the foot of her bed, just staring. I didn't remember any of it. I saw doctors, therapists, even tried a priest. Nothing worked. Whatever it was, it hadn't left me. I started researching, digging into Barlow Ridge. It wasn't just hikers who had gone missing. There were reports buried deep in old newspaper archives of entire families who once lived in the area, disappearing overnight in the early 1900s. No signs of struggle, just vanished. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the land being wrong, a place the native tribes avoided even before settlers arrived. Some said it was cursed. Others believed it was a thin place, where the veil between this world and another had torn open. I haven't been back since, but I feel it even now watching me, waiting. Sometimes I wake up in places I don't remember falling asleep. Once I found dirt under my nails and pine needles in my hair. My sister caught me trying to walk out the door barefoot in the middle of the night. Last week, I saw it again. Not in a dream. In my living room, standing just outside the sliding glass door. Same shape, same faceless void. No words this time. Just a long, slow tap on the glass. I moved again yesterday. I don't know how long I can keep running, but I know one thing now. There are places in this world that do not want to be found, places that are forgotten for a reason. I went there alone, and I came back, not quite alone anymore. Story the end. I decided to take a solo trip into the mountains, something I'd been planning for months. The idea was simple. Disconnect from the noise of everyday life, breathe fresh air, and hike through the wilderness for a few days. I wasn't looking for anything supernatural or strange. I just wanted peace and solitude. But what happened changed everything I believed about the world. The trip started smoothly. I packed light, carried just enough food, water, and gear for the hike, and set off early in the morning. The trailhead was a small, barely marked path off a rural road, surrounded by dense pine trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. As I walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of civilization disappeared. Birdsong replaced car engines, and the only footsteps I heard were my own. By late afternoon, I found a clearing near a small creek. It seemed like a perfect place to set up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered some dry wood, and built a small fire. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink as the sun set behind the mountains, and the air grew cooler. After eating a simple meal, I sat by the fire, letting the quiet wash over me. As darkness settled, I noticed how alive the forest felt. The crackling of the fire was the only steady sound. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig made me glance up, but I never saw anything. Still, I felt completely safe. I was alone, but that was what I wanted. Then, just as I was about to crawl into my sleeping bag, I heard it, a faint whisper carried by the wind. At first, I thought it was the wind itself, or maybe an animal. But the sound didn't stop. It grew clearer, forming words I couldn't quite make out. My heart started to race, and I sat up, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing was there. I told myself it was just my imagination and tried to ignore it. I zipped up my tent and lay down but the whispers continued, now seeming to come from all directions at once. They sounded like soft voices, calling out in a language I didn't know. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly, drenched in sweat. The whispers were gone, replaced by something else. The sound of footsteps circling my tent, slow, deliberate, and heavy. I froze, listening as the footsteps paused, then moved away. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but the weight of the steps felt too human. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam around the clearing. The light caught nothing but trees and shadows. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. Shaking, I crawled back inside and locked the tent zipper. The next day, I tried to shake off the fear. I told myself I'd imagined everything. Maybe I was just stressed from being alone. I packed up and continued along the trail, keeping my eyes open but seeing nothing unusual. Late that afternoon, I reached an old, abandoned cabin tucked away between the trees. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. The wood was rotten, the windows shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. For some reason, I felt drawn to it. Maybe it was curiosity or a strange urge I couldn't explain. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The air was thick with dust and decay. On the floor, scattered papers and broken furniture told stories of a long-forgotten past. I found a journal lying on a rickety table and flipped through it. The writing was faded, but I could make out fragments, entries about loneliness, despair, and something the writer called the Watcher. I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The cabin was empty, or so I thought. A chill ran down my spine as I shut the journal and hurried outside. That night, I camped further down the trail. The whispers returned, louder this time, and I heard the footsteps again. They didn't circle. They came closer, stopping just outside my tent. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. Suddenly, a shadow moved past the tent's mesh window. I flicked on my flashlight, but there was nothing there. The feeling of being watched was suffocating. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, as I packed my gear, I noticed something disturbing. Scratches, deep, jagged, on the outside of my tent. Fresh. I had never seen anything near my campsite the day before, so someone or something had been there while I was inside. My heart pounded. I debated turning back, but I was already far from the trailhead, and the thought of a long hike back terrified me more than whatever was stalking me. As I moved on, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees looked twisted, their branches reaching like fingers. The path was harder to follow, and every few minutes I thought I heard the whispers again. That night, I found a small clearing to camp. I built a fire and kept it burning all night, not daring to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard a loud crack from the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the noise. At first, I saw nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, a figure appeared. It was a man, pale and gaunt, standing perfectly still, staring at me. His eyes were black pits, his clothes tattered and soaked in mud. I couldn't tell if he was alive or some ghostly apparition. I froze, unable to move or speak. The figure raised a hand and pointed directly at me. Then it slowly faded away into the trees. I didn't sleep again. The next day, I pushed myself to keep moving, but the trail grew more confusing. It felt like the forest was shifting, twisting in ways that made no sense. I saw glimpses of that man again, just shadows at first, then clearer and closer. I was terrified, but also fascinated. Was I going crazy, or was this something real? On the third night, the whispering turned into voices. They spoke my name over and over. I stayed awake all night, clutching my flashlight and a pocket knife. Suddenly, just before dawn, the tent zipper began sliding down by itself. I shouted and grabbed my knife, ready for whoever was there. No one was there. But outside, just beyond the tent's light, I saw footprints in the mud, fresh footprints leading toward the dark woods. I packed up immediately and started hiking as fast as I could. The forest seemed endless, the trail nowhere to be found. Panic set in, and the whispers and footsteps followed me. Hours later, I stumbled onto a dirt road. I ran until I saw a car approaching. The driver stopped and helped me. I told him my story, and he looked grave. "You weren't supposed to be on that trail," he said. "People say that forest is cursed. Many who enter don't come back, or come back changed. They say the spirits don't like visitors, especially those who come alone." I didn't believe in ghosts before that trip, but after what I experienced, I wasn't so sure. I left the mountains behind, but the memories still haunt me. Sometimes late at night, I swear I hear whispers just outside my window. Story, the end. I set off on the trip because I needed to get away, completely alone. The kind of alone where your phone doesn't ring, your email doesn't ping, and no one knows exactly where you are. I booked a small cabin deep in the woods of Vermont, miles from the nearest town. It was supposed to be a weekend of peace, reflection, and resetting my frayed nerves. I wanted to be alone with nature, or maybe just alone with myself. What I got instead was something I'm still trying to make sense of, something I never expected to happen. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun just beginning to dip behind thick pines. The cabin was small, rustic, and looked exactly like the photos online. Weathered wood, a stone chimney, and a porch swing hanging quietly in the fading light. No cell signal. No Wi-Fi. Perfect. The road to get there was rough, a single lane of gravel twisting through dense forest. I locked the car and took a deep breath. The air smelled like pine needles and earth, fresh and sharp. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of smoke and old wood, like it hadn't been used in a while. There was a stack of firewood beside the hearth, a small kitchen with basic supplies, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft bedroom. I unpacked my bag, made a quick dinner, and lit a fire in the stone fireplace. Outside, the forest grew darker, the trees black silhouettes against the sky turning to ink. I decided to take a short walk before nightfall. The trail behind the cabin wound down to a small creek, its water clear and bubbling over smooth stones. I stood there for a while, listening to the rush of the water, the rustle of leaves. No birds, no insects, just silence except for the creek. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. When I returned, the sky was fully dark. The cabin's single light bulb cast a warm glow inside. I settled in with a book, but my thoughts were restless. I kept thinking I heard something outside. The snap of a twig, the faint crunch of leaves. I told myself it was just deer or raccoons. Around 10 p.m., I decided to go to bed. The loft was small but cozy, a mattress on the floor with thick blankets. I shut off the light and lay there, listening to the sounds of the night. The wind whispered through the trees, branches tapping softly against the cabin. After a while, I drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The air felt colder, and there was an uneasy feeling pressing down on me. Then I heard it, a soft knocking, tapping, coming from the porch outside. It was slow and rhythmic, like someone tapping a finger on wood. I told myself it was the wind or an animal and closed my eyes. The knocking continued, slow and steady, not loud but unmistakable. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. Then it stopped. I waited, breath held. After a moment, it started again, this time accompanied by a faint scratching noise, like claws scraping the porch railing. I turned on my phone's flashlight and peered out the window. The porch was empty. The trees swayed gently in the night, shadows flickering in the beam. No animals, no movement. I checked the door. It was locked tight. I tried to go back to sleep, but the feeling lingered. At one point, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line, a dark shape that disappeared the moment I blinked. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light. The next day, I stayed close to the cabin. I tried to focus on hiking and photographing the forest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At one point, while walking along a narrow path, I stopped and heard something behind me. Footsteps? But when I looked back, there was no one there. When I returned to the cabin that evening, I found the firewood I had stacked neatly outside knocked over in a messy pile. The wind was calm, no rain or anything that could have caused it. I didn't think much of it at first, maybe an animal. I built a fire and cooked dinner, trying to relax. But as night fell again, the cabin seemed to change. The shadows grew longer and deeper. The air grew colder, unnaturally so. I found myself jumping at every creak or groan of the old wood. At around midnight, the knocking started again. 3 slow knocks, then a pause, then 3 more. This time it wasn't just on the porch, but on the door itself. I sat frozen, unsure whether to open it or not. I couldn't see anyone out there. I called out, "Hello," but there was no reply. The knocking stopped, and in the silence that followed, I heard something else, a low whispering. It was barely audible, like voices just beyond the window, soft and indistinct. I pressed my ear to the door, heart racing. The whispers stopped immediately. I checked my phone. Still no signal. I was completely cut off. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe the old cabin was messing with me, or maybe loneliness was getting to my head. I decided to write in my journal to calm down, jotting down what happened. The scratching noises, the knocks, the whispers. I tried to laugh it off, but felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged in the air. The fire flickered violently, shadows dancing wildly on the walls. Then the door slammed shut with a thunderous bang, though I had left it open slightly for the cool night air. I rushed to the door and pulled. It wouldn't budge. I felt a cold hand brush my shoulder, but when I turned, no one was there. The knocking started again. Faster now, almost frantic, I shouted, "Who's there?" But only silence answered. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open by itself. I stumbled back, heart racing. Outside, the porch was empty except for a single black feather lying on the floorboards. I picked it up, smooth and cold. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn finally came, I packed my things quickly, wanting to leave. But as I stepped outside, I saw something that stopped me cold. Written in the dirt near the porch steps were letters, scraped deep into the earth. They spelled out a single word: stay. My hands trembled as I loaded the car. I didn't look back once, just drove away as fast as I could on the winding gravel road. Back in town, I told the locals about the cabin and the strange things I experienced. An older man frowned and said quietly, "That cabin's been empty for years. The last owner disappeared without a trace. Some say the place is cursed." I never went back. I still can't explain what I saw or heard. But sometimes late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I swear I hear tapping, slow, steady knocking, like a reminder that some places are meant to be left alone. Story the end. I had always been the kind of person who needed space. Crowds drained me. Noise stressed me out, and the constant buzz of daily life left me feeling like I was suffocating. So when the opportunity arose to take a week off work, I jumped at the chance to do a solo trip. I wanted somewhere remote, peaceful, far from civilization, but with enough history to be interesting. After some searching, I booked a small cabin in the Appalachian Mountains, not far from a town called Elkins in West Virginia. The cabin was isolated down a long dirt road surrounded by dense forest and had no cell reception, a perfect place to disconnect. I arrived late afternoon after a long drive. The last few miles were rough, the dirt road riddled with potholes and overgrown with weeds. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows through the tall pine trees. The cabin was old but sturdy, made of dark weathered logs, with a small porch and a chimney with no smoke. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for some time, but the door was unlocked, just like the listing had said. Stepping inside, the smell hit me: dust, damp wood, and something faintly metallic, like old blood or rust. The floor creaked underfoot, and patches of sunlight filtered through the dirty windows. The place was simple: a small living room with a fireplace, a narrow kitchen with a rusty stove, and one bedroom with a creaky bed. There was no phone, no internet, and no television. Just me and the wilderness. I unpacked quickly, started a fire in the hearth, and settled down with a book I had brought. I was tired, but the strange atmosphere kept me alert. Something about the cabin felt off, but I told myself it was just because I was alone in an unfamiliar place. That night, I slept fitfully, waking multiple times to the sounds of the forest: twigs snapping, leaves rustling, distant hoots of owls. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a soft tapping noise. At first, I thought it was rain against the window, but the glass was dry. The tapping was slow and deliberate, like someone was knocking on the wooden siding outside. I held my breath, straining to listen. The noise stopped abruptly. I debated whether to investigate, but felt a cold knot of fear in my stomach. I told myself it was probably a branch hitting the house or an animal scratching at the wood. The next morning, I explored the surrounding woods in daylight. The forest was dense, filled with towering oaks and maples, their leaves beginning to turn golden and red. I found an old rusted iron gate a few hundred yards from the cabin, half buried in moss and fallen leaves. It led to a narrow path, which I followed until it opened onto a small clearing with crumbling stone foundations. Curious, I wandered through the remains of what must have been a house or small building. The stones were old, cracked, and covered in ivy. There was no sign of who had lived here, but the sense of sadness lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. I took some photos and headed back before the sun started to dip. That night, the tapping came again, louder and more insistent. This time, it was on the front door. I sat frozen on the couch, flashlight in hand, my heart pounding. The knocking went on for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. Suddenly, I heard a low, whispering voice, barely audible, like someone speaking just out of earshot. I couldn't make out words, but it sounded desperate, almost pleading. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" But there was no response. The whispering faded, replaced by the sound of heavy footsteps pacing just outside the cabin. I pressed myself against the wall, too scared to move. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the porch, then a long silence. Then a soft thud, like something heavy being dropped. I forced myself to get up and look outside. Flashlight beam cut through the dark, illuminating the porch. Nothing there but the fallen leaves scattered by the wind. I locked all the doors and windows, then sat by the fire, trying to calm down. I debated leaving the next day, but I wanted to prove to myself I wasn't scared, that I could handle this. The following days passed with more unease than outright terror. Small things shifted places inside the cabin. My keys would be on the table one moment, then found on the floor the next. The firewood I stacked neatly would sometimes be scattered the next morning. I kept finding faint footprints in the dirt around the porch, but when I checked closely, they were small, child-sized. One afternoon, while hiking on a trail marked on the map, I stumbled upon an old cemetery hidden behind a thicket of brush. The headstones were weathered and broken, dates going back over 100 years. Most of the stones were for children, a few as young as 2 or 3 years old. A chill ran down my spine as I read the inscriptions. One grave was for a girl named Mary Ellen, who died in 1892, age 5. Another nearby was for her younger brother, Thomas, who died a year later. I felt a strange pull to the graves, like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I left quickly, trying to shake the feeling. That night, I dreamed of a little girl in a white dress standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes dark and hollow. She whispered my name over and over, her voice sad and distant. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. Over the next couple of nights, the tapping grew into pounding on doors, windows, and the walls themselves. The whispering voices multiplied, overlapping in a chilling chorus of pleas and cries. I heard footsteps pacing the cabin floor above me, even though there was no second story. On the 4th night, I found scratch marks on the doorframe, long, deep gouges like someone had tried to claw their way inside. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things at first light and left without looking back. A week later, back in my apartment in the city, I found something disturbing. Among my photos from the trip was one I didn't remember taking, a blurry image of the cabin porch, but in the shadows stood a small figure, pale and indistinct, watching me. I never went back to that cabin or to the mountains. The feeling that I had disturbed something, that something had followed me home, stayed with me. I sometimes still hear faint tapping on my apartment windows at night and soft whispers in the dark. I don't know what I encountered on that trip, but I know it was real. Story the end. I set out on my solo trip to the Appalachian Mountains in late September, wanting to escape the noise and chaos of city life for a week. I packed light, a tent, a sleeping bag, some canned food, water, a small stove, and a worn-out map that showed a few lesser-known trails and old cabins marked deep in the forest. The idea was to hike, camp, and clear my head. Nothing fancy, just me and nature. I arrived at the trailhead early afternoon, like the sky a clear blue with a few lazy clouds drifting by. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional bird call and the rustle of the wind through the trees. The air was crisp and cool, smelling of pine and earth. I set off on a narrow path that wound up and down hills past thick stands of oaks and maples, their leaves beginning to turn red and gold. After about 3 hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing near the side of a ridge where I planned to set up camp for the night. The spot was perfect, high enough for a good view of the valley below with a gentle brook trickling nearby. I pitched my tent and gathered some firewood, lighting a small campfire just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The first night was peaceful. The stars came out in full force, and I lay back, staring up at the sky through the mesh of my tent's roof, feeling content and small beneath the vast universe. I fell asleep to the gentle sound of the brook. But things began to change on the second night. I had planned to hike a bit further that day, following a faint trail my map showed that led to an old, abandoned cabin, one of the few marked structures on this part of the mountain. I set off mid-morning, my steps crunching on dry leaves and twigs. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest grew, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. When I reached the cabin, it was more dilapidated than I expected. The roof sagged in the middle, the windows were broken, and the door hung open on rusty hinges. The air smelled stale and cold. I hesitated at the threshold, but curiosity pushed me forward. Inside, the floor was covered in dirt and leaves, and spiderwebs hung thick in the corners. I saw an old wood stove, some rusty cans, and a broken rocking chair tipped over near the wall. As I scanned the room, something caught my eye, a faded photograph pinned to the wall. It was black and white, showing a family standing in front of the cabin, smiling awkwardly. I couldn't make out their faces clearly, but the image gave me an eerie feeling, like the eyes in the photo were watching me. I spent a few minutes taking pictures and exploring the small cabin before heading back to camp as the light faded again. That night, as I lay in my tent, I heard a noise. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon scavenging nearby, but the noise was rhythmic, deliberate. It sounded like footsteps, slow and heavy, moving through the underbrush just beyond the firelight's reach. I froze, listening. The footsteps stopped, then started again, closer this time, circling the camp. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination or some forest creature. But sleep wouldn't come easily. I kept hearing those steps, and then faint whispers, like low voices just out of hearing range. The whispers were too soft to understand, but they felt urgent, like they were warning me or calling me somewhere. I didn't sleep well, and when dawn finally broke, I packed up quickly, eager to leave. As I walked down the trail, I noticed something odd. Fresh footprints in the dirt, not mine, and definitely not animal tracks. They were too large and deep to be anything but human, but there was no one else on the trail. The prints circled my path for a while before fading into the undergrowth. My heart raced. I sped up, glancing nervously over my shoulder. No one was there. The next 2 days passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Every time I stopped to rest, I felt eyes on me, like I was being watched from the shadows. On the 4th day, I decided to take a detour off the main trail, hoping to find a small lake marked on my map. I wanted to cool off and maybe fish for dinner. The forest thickened, the trees growing closer together until the sunlight barely touched the forest floor. The trail became harder to follow, overgrown with vines and fallen branches. I hacked my way forward, sweating in the sticky afternoon heat. Suddenly, the trees opened up into a small clearing. The lake lay before me, dark and still, reflecting the gray sky. I dropped my pack, sat by the water's edge, and took a deep breath. Then I saw it. Near the far side of the lake, just beyond the brush, stood a figure. At first, I thought it was another hiker. The figure was tall and thin, wearing a long, dark coat that seemed out of place in the heat. But as I squinted, the figure didn't move. I called out tentatively. No response. I took a few cautious steps closer, heart pounding. The figure remained perfectly still, then slowly it turned. The face was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to suck the light from the air. Its mouth hung slightly open as if it had forgotten how to speak. I stumbled backward, terror gripping me. The figure didn't move again, but somehow radiated an intense cold that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I ran, back through the forest, scrambling over roots and rocks, not daring to look back. When I finally burst out onto the main trail, panting and sweating, I didn't stop until I reached my camp for the night. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every sound. The snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of owls. On my last full day, I packed up early, determined to get back to my car and out of the woods. But as I was breaking camp, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a small wooden carving stuck in the dirt near my tent. It was crudely made, shaped like a figure with hollow eyes and a twisted mouth, almost like the thing I saw by the lake. My hands trembled as I picked it up. I felt an overwhelming wave of dread wash over me. Suddenly, the whispers started again, louder this time. They circled me like a storm, words I couldn't understand but felt deeply threatening. I dropped the carving and bolted down the trail. The last stretch of the hike was a blur. I didn't stop to rest, even when my legs burned and my breath came in ragged gasps. I kept hearing footsteps behind me, just out of sight, matching my pace. When I finally reached the parking lot, I threw my pack in the car and locked the doors. I started the engine and drove away, not looking back. That night, safe at home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something back with me, some darkness from those woods. The carving sat on my kitchen table, silent and still. I never went back to the Appalachians after that trip. Sometimes when the wind howls outside or the power flickers, I swear I hear those footsteps and whispers again, just beyond the edge of my mind. Story: the end. I took a solo trip to a remote cabin in the woods, hoping to escape the noise of the city and get some peace. The cabin was small, older, but still had the basic comforts: a small kitchen, a wood stove, and an old-fashioned lantern hanging near the entrance. Cell service was spotty, but I told myself that was part of the charm. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just me and nature. The first day went smoothly. I arrived mid-morning, unpacked my things, and spent the afternoon hiking a few miles of the nearby trails. The woods were dense but quiet, the kind of quiet where you notice every bird call and crackling twig underfoot. At night, I made a fire in the stone fireplace and settled in with a book. The silence was soothing. But the second night was different. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a faint noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. Soft footsteps on the wooden porch outside. The floorboards creaked in a way that didn't match the rhythm of the wind. I froze, listening hard. The footsteps stopped abruptly. I sat up in bed and reached for my phone, hoping to call someone, but as expected, there was no signal. My heart started to race. Maybe it was an animal or someone passing by. The cabin was far from any road or town. I got up slowly and grabbed the old lantern from the hall table. Lighting it, I crept toward the front door and peered through the small window. Nothing. Just the black outline of trees swaying faintly in the moonlight. No one was there. I tried to calm myself and went back to bed, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it again. This time it was a whisper, so soft I almost thought I was dreaming. Help! I sat upright again, heart pounding. The voice sounded close, just outside the cabin. I grabbed my jacket and stepped onto the porch. The night air was cold and sharp, and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. I called out, "Hello? Who's there?" Only silence answered. The next morning, I told myself I'd probably imagined the voice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that day, while exploring the woods, I found an old trail marker pointing to a small cemetery that wasn't on any of the maps I'd seen. Curious, I followed the trail. It was overgrown and almost hidden by brambles. When I reached the clearing, I found a tiny graveyard with about a dozen unkempt headstones, many of them weathered and cracked with age. One of the stones caught my eye. It was fresher than the others, with a name and date from only a few years ago. The name was a woman's, Anna Martin. The dates indicated she had died mysteriously in her late 20s. I felt a chill as I stood there. The woods suddenly seemed darker, heavier. I took a picture of the grave and turned back toward the cabin, trying to shake off the unease. That night, the strange noises came back. Footsteps, whispering, and now something new. A faint knocking sound on the back window. The knocking was slow, deliberate, almost like someone trying to get in. I didn't dare check the window, but kept my eyes fixed on it. The knocking stopped after a few minutes, but I was too afraid to sleep. Around 4 a.m., the power went out. The whole cabin went dark, except for the small glow of the dying fire in the hearth. The lantern was out of oil, and my phone was dead. Then I heard it clearly. Footsteps inside the cabin, not outside, inside. Slow, measured steps on the wooden floorboards downstairs. I stayed frozen in bed, holding my breath. The steps stopped just below the stairs. Then came the whisper again. "Help me." I whispered back, "Who are you? What do you want?" No answer, just silence. In the morning, I found muddy footprints on the floor near the stairs, wet and irregular, like someone had been walking barefoot. I packed my things quickly and left the cabin. I told no one about the experience, afraid they'd think I was crazy. Back home, I researched Anna Martin. She had disappeared while hiking near that forest, presumed dead, though her body was never found. Some locals whispered about hauntings near the cabin, but the stories were vague and dismissed as folklore. I never went back. Sometimes late at night, when the wind howls, I swear I still hear that faint whisper calling my name. Story the end. I left the city with nothing but a backpack, my camera, and a strong urge to get away. It had been a brutal year. Work burnout, a breakup that still left a bad taste, and the noise of everything crowding my mind. So I planned a solo trip to the mountains, somewhere quiet, somewhere I could hear myself think. I picked a remote cabin near the edge of a national forest, accessible only by a rough dirt road. No cell service. No Wi-Fi. No distractions. I arrived just before sunset. The cabin was older but sturdy, made of dark, weathered logs. It looked like the kind of place people used to stay in during hunting season or summer vacations decades ago. The owner left a note with the key in a lockbox by the door, which felt almost too easy. I unpacked quickly, then went outside to breathe in the pine-scented air. The sky was a patchwork of purple and orange streaks. The forest was silent except for the occasional bird settling in for the night. I wanted to take pictures of the sunset, so I pulled out my camera and aimed at the horizon. As I adjusted the lens, a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't the cold, the air was warm, almost humid. It was the feeling of being watched. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing, just trees, shadows, and the fading light. I shook it off, told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, I was alone out here. No one around for miles. The kind of solitude I thought I craved. That first night, I set up the small propane stove, cooked some canned chili, and settled in with a book. The cabin had a fireplace, but I didn't want to risk a fire on my own, so I kept the lantern on low. As I read, I heard faint noises outside, a twig snapping, a soft rustle in the brush. I told myself it was probably deer or some small animal, but then came a different sound, almost like footsteps crunching leaves, but slower, deliberate. Not the quick patter of an animal fleeing. I put down the book and sat still, heart racing. The cabin door was locked, the windows shut tight. Whatever was out there couldn't get in easily. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, sweeping the beam over the trees. Nothing moved. The footsteps stopped. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard it again. That slow crunching of leaves. I kept waiting for it to stop, but it didn't. It just stayed out there, circling the cabin, never getting closer, never going away. By morning, I was exhausted, but tried to convince myself it was just nerves. The forest is full of sounds at night. I packed up some gear and went for a hike along a narrow trail marked on my map. The trees grew tall and close, blocking most of the sunlight. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. After a while, I stopped to rest near a small clearing. I set my backpack down and noticed something odd. An old, weather-beaten sign nailed to a tree at the edge of the clearing. The paint was faded, but I could just make out the words, "Do not enter." Below that, scratched in with a knife, was another message, "Leave now." I felt a sudden wave of unease, but figured it was some prank from hunters or kids messing around. I took a quick picture of the sign and headed back. That night the footsteps returned, louder this time. Not just around the cabin, but inside. I was sure I heard the creak of the floorboards upstairs, but the cabin only had one floor. I told myself to calm down. I set up a camera to record overnight, something I'd never done before, just to prove to myself there was nothing supernatural going on. I fell asleep sitting in the corner, flashlight in hand. The next morning, I was eager to review the footage. The video showed nothing unusual at first, just the empty cabin with flickering shadows from the lantern. Then, around 3 a.m., a faint shape appeared in the corner of the frame, a dark, blurry silhouette, barely visible. It seemed to drift toward the window and then disappear. My skin crawled. I rewound and played again, but the shape was definitely there. Not an animal, not a shadow cast by anything obvious. Something unnatural. I wanted to leave immediately, but my car was down the dirt road a good 15-minute walk away. And besides, I needed to gather my things and pack. That afternoon, I took another hike, staying on the main trail this time. But the forest felt different, like it was holding its breath. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the light grew dimmer, even though it was still early. I came across a patch of wildflowers growing in a circle, almost perfectly round, like a small ritual site. In the center, a cluster of smooth black stones arranged in a pattern I couldn't decipher. The air here was cold, even though the rest of the forest was warm. I had the urge to leave, but curiosity held me there for a moment longer. Suddenly, I heard the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I rushed back to the cabin, feeling like something was chasing me, unseen but relentless. That night, the cabin felt oppressive. I heard whispering voices just beyond the walls, low murmurs I couldn't make out. I covered my ears, but the sound seeped in anyway, like water through cracks. Sleep was impossible. I stayed up all night, watching the windows, flashlight shaking in my hands. At dawn, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I packed frantically, ready to leave. The car was where I left it, but as I got in, my phone buzzed. Finally a signal, a text from an unknown number: "You shouldn't have come." My hands trembled as I hit the gas and sped down the dirt road. The forest blurred past, the trees seeming to lean toward the car, reaching out like dark fingers. I didn't stop until I reached the highway and the first gas station. I filled the tank, trying to calm down. When I looked back at my phone, another message had come through. A photo. It was a picture of the cabin taken from the outside, but I hadn't taken it. In the window was the same dark silhouette from the video, staring straight at me. I deleted the messages and turned off my phone. I don't know what I saw that weekend. Maybe it was the stress, the isolation, my imagination running wild. But I still carry that photo, stored away in a folder I rarely open, because sometimes when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear slow footsteps outside my window. Circling, waiting. Story the end.